welcome to the first, maybe not the last, Youth Perspectives on National Security Forum. And congratulations to all the We the People students. I hear it was a banner year. Did well in your competitions and the like. But let's move on because we have a lot on our plate today. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Karen Helgerson, President of Tmcc, to welcome us. Afterwards, I'll give some instructions.
All right. Thank you, Anna. So first of all, welcome to Tmcc. So give me a big good morning. Good morning. Oh, I don't even need to ask you to do that again. That was very well done. I think you're ready. So as part of my welcome, I wanted to sort of take a little trip down a memory lane, and that is to talk to you a little bit about where I found my voice and where I learned to explore. It started in Modesto, California. Anyone know where that is? You been there? We got some Modesto. Okay, that's where I was born. And my mom and dad were immigrants. And they immigrated from some weird places, but I can tell you this, both of them experienced in a very first-hand way and a very painful way World War II. And so one of the things that I learned growing up was that peace is much, much better than war. Much, much better than war. My dad picture a young man living in occupied Holland. He was 6 foot, weighed about 100 pounds because there was no food, you know, when you were occupied and you were Dutch, not German, right? So it was a very scary time for my father. My mom was also in an occupied place, and I'm not going to go into that today. It's too painful. But during World War II, she was orphaned. So at the age of 7, she lost her mom and dad, and she almost starved to death as well. So I can tell you this, the family I grew up in, they had first-hand observation that peace is much, much better than war. So I'm going to start there. But the other place that I grew to love in Modesto, California was our library, the city library. I could take the bus there on Saturdays, and back in those days, libraries were as quiet as cemeteries on a Monday night. And in my weird, nerdy way, I loved it. I loved the smell of the books. I liked that I could be in a quiet place and find a little nook it was a beautiful new renovated library, probably old now, but back then it was really a beautiful library. And I loved that library. And then when I went to college, I fell in love with the college libraries that I habitated quite a lot. Even though libraries back then were as quiet as cemeteries on a Monday night, boy, they awoke in the mind. They awoke in the mind. And that's where I learned that there is a big difference between fact and opinion. There is a big difference between what is observed in history and accurately recorded or accurately expressed in a good story to 3 little kids who grew up in an immigrant household of World War II parents, right? Today, I want to encourage you, as part of today, to continue your exploration. It really is about the life of the mind. I feel sorry for some of you in some respects because you are bombarded with digital communications day in and day out. It must be so hard for you to find those quiet nooks in those old-fashioned libraries because what do we all have? Right? We've got this and social media. You've got a total confusion in American society right now between fake journalism and real journalism. And I'm not talking, I don't like the word fake news because I do think that some of our journalists who are really continuing to do a good job are being accused of being fake, and I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong. So I want you to change the world. And your job is so much more complicated than it was when I was a kid. It really is. I'm counting on you. I think a lot of us are. We're counting on you to take the complex reality that you now live in and to make the most of it, but learn to discern truth from fiction, learn to do it through observable fact and understand the difference between fact and opinion, and most importantly for today, explore and find your voice. explore and find your voice, because we need your voices. We really do, probably now more than any other time in my life in American society. And I'm old, so that says a lot. With that, keep your chin up, keep your head high, find your voice, and have a great day sharing this space with other great minds at TMCC. Thank you.
Thank you to all the students who were here for this event. I had a wonderful time this morning in our session. So some of you who are in my session this morning got a little bit of preview of what I'm going to say, but not everything. And I will be asking for your input as I go along, because you just had a stimulating morning. You've just had lunch. So we're going to make this an interactive presentation. So as Anna mentioned, I am the program director for the National Security Forum. That's one of my hats. And short bio, I am also faculty at the University of Nevada, Reno in physics, and at the Desert Research Institute, where I run a research center focused on the impacts of climate change on water and agriculture throughout the western United States. I came to this area in 2009 after an arduous nearly 15 years in Washington, D.C. So my background is in national security. I come out of the nuclear nonproliferation world. I was working in the Pentagon originally when I went back to Washington, served as an advisor on the arms control negotiations with the Russians and the former Soviet Union. And then I became the chief scientist for the National Nuclear Security Administration in the Clinton administration. So many of you remember, yes, there was a Clinton administration, not that Clinton. And then after 9/11, when I was in Washington, I was what we called seconded to the White House, and I worked in the Bush White House until 2003, when we stood up the Department of Homeland Security. I was the first director of research and development, and then moved into the intelligence community to work on problems. And when 2009 came and the Obama administration came in, my husband said, "You are so tired, you're not making any sense, we're going west." So we drove west until we got to Lake Tahoe, and we stopped, and here we are. So luckily, I'm enjoying life on the western part of the country. I do get back to Washington way too often. But so I come out of both the science side, the national security side, and relevant to climate change. I was one of the leaders of the first national intelligence assessment on climate, on the impacts of climate on national security in 2008 in the Bush administration. So what I'm going to talk to you today about, and I'm going to get your input, so beware. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how climate manifests, how changes in the climate are manifested as threats to national security. So with that, let's go. All right. We're going to start with a really simple question. How many of you either participated in or know somebody who participated in Climate Fridays? Wahoo! Okay, a few of you. Okay, so kudos. Next generation, it's a start. Protesting helps, it's not everything, but Climate Fridays was your generation's marker in the ground that you care about this issue. And you're not alone. So let's just start with a little discussion. How many people think they know what national security is? Well, you should. You work in the legislature. Okay, so if you go home tonight and you Google the term national security, you will find a lot of definitions. You would think we would have one single definition of national security. But we don't even have that. I found definitions on the internet obviously from the Defense Department, the State Department, the intelligence community. I even found a definition of national security codified in the Arizona Education Standards. So even the state of Arizona defined national security slightly differently than the US government does. But when you think about national security, the definition of national security has really morphed since over years. It used to be foreign policy, foreign engagement, diplomacy, and military action. Those were the two things that bracketed national security. It now has become, I gotta move, I can't stand here. It's now become much broader. It's not only about diplomacy and military action. It's about the homeland. So I just came to the startling realization that almost this entire room was born, well, with a few exceptions of those of us who've been around for a while, but all of you were born post 9/11. So you were born after after we brought into existence the Department of Homeland Security. So now national security encompasses the homeland. It also encompasses other softer things, values, democracy, other things that we care about as a country that we engage and we protect and we want to protect. So think about that broadly when you think about national security. You all just dealt with discussions on national security that covered everything from immigration to diplomacy, to democracy, to climate change, to emergency response. All of that falls in that realm of things we care about in this country. So what are threats to national security? Well, amazingly enough, how many of you think, raise a hand, how many of you think climate change was identified as a threat to national security by this administration? No hands. Okay, the document that I'm citing up here is actually a government accountability project. It is a report to Congress. It discusses the top emerging threats to national security. It was published in December of 2018. It actually wasn't released until early January this year. And in red, okay, granted, on the bottom of the list of their emerging threats is climate change, migration, spread of infectious disease, all those things considered to be environmental drivers. So even this administration, with all the things that you hear politically, they're telling themselves this is an emerging threat. Okay, so how do we respond to threats to national security? What do we actually do? For those of us who've worked in the national security communities, what is it that we do? And we do these things kind of in a cycle. Sometimes we do them better than others. But one of the first things we do is we try and anticipate what those threats are. We can't wait until something's happened. We have to know right up front who is responsible for something. Then we have to look at risks and vulnerabilities. We have to know what the impacts are from that threat. What do we anticipate could happen, or in some cases have happened? Then we have to make plans and policies, and we have to decide what our options are to respond. And then we have to take action. Do or do not. There is no try. Any Yoda fans here? Any? Yes! Okay. My husband made me put that one in. We have a giant stuffed Yoda in our living room. So do or do not try. You have to be decisive when you take actions against threats. Then you have to look at, was it effective? You don't just take an action and walk away. You have to know, did it work, right? Makes sense. And then the step that we often don't take but really need to do more often is, then what happened? Okay, so it was a really good idea to invade Iraq, but now we're, 15 years later, and we're still embroiled in a large national security mess there. So assessing the unintended consequences, and then start the loop all over again. Who are the threats, and what do we do about it? Now, I put this up intentionally because I want to show you where changes in the climate factor into this circle. So, do we take climate change seriously in the national security community? Even in this administration. So don't, just put on your Yoda filters when you listen to the news. This administration takes climate change seriously, not all of it, and some of the louder ones don't necessarily endorse this, but this is a report that is what we call the Worldwide Threat Assessment. It's a requirement for the Director of National Intelligence to present this to Congress every year. This is the report that was presented at the end of January 2019, so very recently, okay? In the Worldwide Threat Assessment, they have several threats identified in detail, but there's a whole section in there on environmental impacts. And one of the threats is climate hazards, extreme weather, higher temperatures, droughts, wildfires, storms, sea level rise. All these things are causing intensifying issues for the health and well-being of people around the world. And when the health and well-being of the people around the world, or even in the United States, are threatened, that's a threat to national security. So let's go into a little more. Thank you. Oop, go back one. I think, yes. Yeah. Okay, extreme weather. Where's Kevin? Kevin, wave. Kevin's my partnership in emergency disasters and extreme events. So extreme weather and sea level rise. So I put up 3 pictures. You may recognize at least 2 of them, maybe. So one is a picture of the tornadoes. This was taken from Texas last week. So extreme storms occurring throughout the United States. The one on the lower left is flooding in Bangladesh. No, sorry, flooding in Thailand as sea level is rising. And that little bubble in the middle, that was my neighbor in 2017 who reached the point of, we've had enough snow in Incline Village. We can't stand it anymore. And he had to, because of the amount of snow we had, and we were stuck in the basin, had to cancel their trip to Hawaii, so he brought the beach to his wife. Yeah, but not until August. Food, so the threat assessment, the Worldwide Threat Assessment goes on to explain that sea level rise, extreme storms, the next category of threats to national security are water and food insecurity. So droughts, loss of land, loss of water sources, extreme heat waves. Not so much an issue this year, 2018, one of the hottest years on record. Okay, we are losing water supplies and food for the places on the planet that need it most. So that picture in the bottom, the bright red areas, those are the areas with the most extreme water stress. And as you can see, they're often in the poorest areas or areas that have the least access to food. They also happen to be in areas where the population is growing the fastest. So as food and water shortages occur around the world, those issues affect us directly. They lead to conflict, they can lead to migration, they can lead to a lot of factors that are direct impacts to our national security. Okay, Joe left. Joe escaped. But my colleague, Joe Schaefer, is an expert in this area. So one of the third area identified in the worldwide threat assessment was the competition in the Arctic. So the Arctic, as many of you know, or you probably know, that climate change is not occurring, global warming is not occurring uniformly. The poles are warming faster than the rest of the planet. Okay, so how many of you heard that it was 84 degrees last week above the Arctic Circle? No joke, no joke. It was 84 degrees. It was 35 in incline. It was 84 above the Arctic Circle. So sea ice is diminishing exceedingly quickly. With that, we are opening up passageways across the Arctic that hadn't been opened since we've been exploring the planet. And that's causing opportunities for exchanges between ourselves and the Russians and the other countries that border the Arctic, all of whom want a little piece or a large piece of the pie of transporting ships across the Arctic, which is a much faster way to get from Northern Europe and Russia across into Asia. So opening up big sea routes. Now, on the right-hand side, you see something sticking out with big teeth. Anybody have any idea what that is? It looks like a shark. That is actually one of Russia's 46 icebreakers, nuclear icebreakers in the Arctic. No joke, they painted it, right? Take a guess, pick a number. How many icebreakers do you think the United States has? Oh, you're cheating, Kevin. But if anybody look back at Kevin, 3, 2, somewhere between 2 and 3, depending on whether you count the one that's in dry dock that's been overhauled, that's 60 years old. The Russians have 46. Guess who gets to do the most control of the seaways in the Arctic when you have to push the ice out of the way? So we're already having a little bit of tug of war, a little bit of nudge and push and shove in the Arctic. As the temperatures get warmer, that area becomes more and more accessible and a bigger threat to our national security. Okay, so how do we think, we in the intelligence community and the national security, how do we think about the climate change? Climate as a threat to national security. It's not a who, right? It's a what. Well, the way we really talk about climate now is to talk about climate change not as a specific threat, but as a threat multiplier. It's the factor. What does that mean? Well, you can guess. It multiplies. Or an accelerant of instability. Great phrase. What does it mean? It means it makes everything just a lot worse. So if you're concerned about water security in places that have vulnerable populations, then warming temperatures and less precipitation makes things worse. If you're worried about food insecurity, then warming temperatures and water shortages makes things worse. And this map shows where climate has really shown to be a threat multiplier. It's making things worse. It's flooding coastal regions. As it floods coastal regions with sea level rise, those are the populations that are most at risk. And most of the world's population, by far, lives within 10 feet of sea level. So small amounts of sea level rise complicated by storm surges means you put a lot of the population at risk. And those red lines show where and how many people are at risk along the coastal lines. And you can see it affects the United States. It's not the only place, But you see a lot of the climate multipliers piling up in Africa. Africa also happens to have the fastest growing population on the planet. So things there, including governance and other things, are getting worse as a result of warming temperatures, unpredictability in terms of precipitation. So the effect the climate has on society is really what the underlying factors are that make it a threat to national security. Climate impacts social stress. It's not necessarily a causative agent of social stress, although in some cases it is. If you're flooded out of your homes, if you no longer have water, if you don't have food, then it's a direct factor. But it's also an impact on all sorts of societies that are struggling with democracy, with governance, and other things. The climate also doesn't play fair, all right? The people who are affected first and the people who are affected the most are the most vulnerable populations on the planet, okay? It is affecting the tropics worse, where we have some of the most extreme poverty. You saw in the previous slide, it affected Africa in particular because of the way that the global circulation patterns are. Water shortages are going to be catastrophic in areas with growing population. And people without food, without water, without shelter, they have only a few options, right? And we've seen this, and I'll give you some more examples. They can flee, they can fight, or they can die. That's where we are right now. So when you think about climate change, just remember it doesn't play fair, right? It's going for the hardest hit populations and it's making their life worse. When there are catastrophes around the world, the United States responds. And we should be proud of that. And we do that because we care, because it's the right thing to do for our security, and because keeping situations stable abroad helps keep us safer at home. So catastrophes abroad. The big circle in the bottom is something you never want to see on your iPhone. So Kevin knows, this was a screenshot that I took when Super Typhoon Haiyan broadsided the Philippines. The little blue dot was me. The fives were Cat 5 typhoon. I was on the third island that was hit. I had been down there planting mangroves to protect villages from the storm surges. I had actually been out in the field planting mangroves that morning before we were put into lockdown in one of the few buildings that survived the onslaught of the typhoon. That was the largest storm that had ever been recorded on the planet. And it came and it got as large as it did in that area because the ocean temperatures were so much warmer than normal. Okay, that was a catastrophe. The United States went down there and responded, as did other countries. But we did it with force and with aplomb and with the US military, and we helped rebuild that area that is still affected by the typhoon. Okay, how many people have heard the story about the frog in boiling water? Okay, a few of you. Right, so there's this urban myth that goes around that if you stick a frog in a pot of cold water and you heat the temperature up really slowly, that the frog will just be, you know, content and not do anything, and it'll just boil it. It'll allow itself to be boiled to death. Well, that's an urban myth. So I just want to tell you that frogs won't let themselves be boiled to death. It is yet to be seen whether human beings will be as wise as our frog brethren. Okay? Recent edition, a little hard to read here, Foreign Affairs, great issue, captured a whole bunch of very detailed essays about the impacts of climate change on national security and foreign affairs issues. It was published in July of 2017. So you can tell that all the references I'm giving you have come out within the last couple of years. This is an issue that is capturing the interest and the impact of communities across the national security community. Almost everybody is dealing with this issue now. So let's bring it closer to home. How many of you have heard about the crisis at the southern border, the mass migration at the southern border? Okay. Got an idea of what's causing it? Give me some impacts. Why are this many people coming here now? Table 1. Got an idea? Why are there so many people coming here? Food and water shortages. Okay? One of the things, we just hear about the migration and the immigration problem as if people somehow or another materialized magically at the southern border and knock on the wall to come in, right? These are thousands of people who are putting their lives at risk to leave the communities they grew up in and tried to live in, to come all the way up thousands of miles to the United States. So there was a recent, very in-depth story done in the New Yorker. This is the picture out of there. This just came out a few weeks ago. And it documented how the highlands of Guatemala have been plagued with drought, warming temperatures and drought. They've lost critical vegetation to feed and grow the crops that they had there. There's also been a complicating factor. As they were no longer able to plant crops, they cut down the trees that surrounded their areas. When they deforested the land got even hotter. They had no habitat left because they cut down the trees. And the cycle continued until they couldn't stand it any longer. The people on the ground in Guatemala who specialize in forestry and land use and community development there said, there are lots of things driving the migration. Desire to be reunited with family members, loss of crops. Every situation that he documented was tied directly back to a change in the climate. So people don't leave the highlands of Guatemala to walk thousands of miles to show up at the US border just because they want a different kind of economic life. Right, so Zeus, what a great name. So Zeus just mentioned that mass migration occurred in the United States back in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl, what we call the Dust Bowl. So when the middle of the country wound up in a terrible drought period that had been accelerated by the fact that Western culture had tried to grow crops in the Midwest, Oklahoma, Texas Panhandle, up into the Midwest. They had lost huge amounts of topsoil. They were no longer supporting the native grasses. When the drought hit in the 1930s, what did the Oklahomans do? This is my husband's family. Where did they go? They went west. They went to California. So there's a whole bunch of people that got displaced at the same time. This happened in the United States. It happened when we had extreme drought. People could no longer survive on that land. They could flee, fight, or die. And they chose to go to California. So this is real. This is a threat. You know that the immigration issue is being dealt with as a national security threat, and it's being driven by changes in the climate and changes in land use practices that live in this very negative cycle. All right, bringing something even closer to home. Fighting fire with heat. So what I show on the left-hand side is a snapshot of the 4th National Climate Assessment. We just put this out in last December. And as you can see, the cover of the 4th assignment, we do this every 4 years. The cover of this volume is the wildfires burning in California. Okay? The droughts that occurred in California have increased the duration of the fire season. Jerry Brown said this before he left office as governor of California. The fire season is essentially 12 months out of the year right now, right? Remember the worst fires that we had burned just a week before Christmas, and then, of course, in California, the worst fire they've ever had in California history has happened every year for the last 3 years. The last one being the Paradise Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise, the Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise. What our projections are because of warming temperatures doesn't just warm the atmosphere, it desiccates, it dries the vegetation. It causes the trees to die. Trees need a certain amount of water. When they're under drought stress, a certain percentage of them will die. It also opens those trees that are weak to infestations of beetles. So by the end of the century, we expect in the West, from our projections, 2 to 6 times the amount of area to be burned as is occurring right now. And that's a lot. So we're fighting fire with heat, and that is a national security issue. The National Guard unit based up in Stead, when they're not being deployed to Afghanistan, they're fighting fires in California or somewhere in the West. So we are using on the US military to fight fires domestically. So lest you think that climate change as a national security threat is a red state issue, or a blue state issue, or a political D issue, or a political R issue, okay? It is a human issue. More importantly, it's your generation's issue, right? It's your world's issue. This quote was by President Bush prior to 9/11, but it was still done in 2001. The issue of climate change respects no border. Its effects cannot be reined in by any army, nor advanced by any ideology. Climate change is, with its potential to impact every corner of the world, is an issue that must be addressed by the world, okay? This is the issue that you take forward. And so, is it an issue for you? How many think climate change is an issue for you or your generation? Right, gotcha. All right. And then often the question comes, yeah, but so what do I do about it? And what you do about it is your decision. But keep in mind that what you do it can have a positive impact. Whatever you do can have a positive impact on our national security. I personally believe it is the defining issue of your generation. I do believe that your generation will carry the responsibility of determining whether we're on that business as usual projection that says by the end of the century we will have warmed the planet by somewhere between 6 and 8 degrees Celsius, or whether we change that trajectory to only warm between 3 and 4 degrees. Right now, there is enough CO2 in the atmosphere that if we stopped emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, we would continue to warm the planet until somewhere about 2050 to 2060. But what you do right now will make a difference. How many of you are going to live to be 100 years old? Yeah, see, a whole bunch of you are going to live to be 100 years old, which means, yeah, well, okay, some of you guys in the back, you're closer to that than others. But to the students here, you're going to live to be 100. You're going to see the end of this century, just like I saw the end of the last century. What you do now with the deciding issue of your generation is your choice, but you have the responsibility, but you also have the privilege to stand up and say, it's my planet, it's my time. I can decide to do what I think is right about this issue. It is a national security issue. It is a world security issue. And there are lots of things you can do. You are already participating and listening. You're reading and listening and learning. And there is a whole lot of stuff out there that is not correct. What was the phrase? It was fake journalism, I believe was your phrase. Know the difference. Learn to read with a very practiced eye and question what you read. Go beyond the bumper stickers, right? This is not an easy issue. It's one of the hardest issues you'll ever deal with. You've already seen it deals with people's lives, their livelihoods, their ability to exist. It infiltrates into governance and everything else. It's complicated. There is nothing simple about it, so don't think there'll be simple solutions. Find your own voice. Decide where you work, where you want to engage, who you want to talk to, what communities you want to be part of. Build resilience. You have to be resilient. The climate will change in your lifetime, whether you like it or not. We're handing that burden to you, right? Our decisions are now impacting where you are and how you will live. You can counter threats and situations that are abroad to build a stronger community at home. You can adapt, and we can, hopefully, learn to mitigate the consequences. But it's your choice. It's your decision. Unfortunately, we, as the older generation, are passing this one on to you. But I am inspired by this group, by your dedication, by your interest in everything that goes along with this. Governance, emergency response, the specifics of climate change, food security, water security, all the things that you cared about today, all the things that you talked about, every single one of them has an issue that touches into what's happening into a warmer climate. So I'm inspired to see this group there. It makes me feel like the planet is in good hands. And so with that, I will close with a photograph from one of my Native American tribes. This was taken on the Hopi Reservation back in March, and it's a stone wall out in the middle of the reservation, and somebody had painted "Water is life." So for you who will learn the key of life, and that there are many things that you can do in this world. You've given me the gift of learning from you about how enthusiastic you are about national security issues, and I wish you well, and I thank you for your attention. I am more than happy to take questions.
I guess a liberal proposition right now to introduce a new Green Deal.
Green New Deal. Okay, great questions. Where's my group? Where's my climate group? So we talked about Green New Deal, okay? And as I said earlier, the Green New Deal has some very positive things, and it has some really big challenges. The biggest challenge is we don't know a whole lot of details about it yet. But one of the things that's positive about the Green New Deal or any major concept to deal with the impacts of climate change is that it's aspirational. It's made us think, it's made us talk. Now, do I believe technically we could get this country off of fossil fuels in the next 10 years, 15 years, whatever it said? Technically, the answer is yes. I mean, the technology's there, definitely. It would take a change in lifestyle. It would take a whole lot of money and a whole lot of political will. So technically, the Green New Deal is achievable. Practically, will it be implemented? Not sure, but keep in mind that and I said this in my group this morning, as many of us remember when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, right? We also, I don't personally remember when Kennedy announced the space program, but I do remember Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. I was 7. President Kennedy didn't say, I'm going to build a rocket to go from Washington to LA. He said, we're going to build a program that puts 3 men in a rocket, goes to the moon, they walk on the moon, and they come home safely again. And everybody said, that's impossible. But it was an aspiration that rallied the country. So I think there are some very positive things about sorting out the details of something as aspirational as the Green New Deal, but I also think aspirational goals are really important.
Question.
So I'm not sure if I know like a lot of details about the Green New Deal. I've read like a 4-page thing on it, so that's about all that's out. But I saw like projections of like how much it's supposed to cost, and I said 93 trillion. And I'm not sure if you know anything about, if you know more about it than me, but do you know how they're supposed to get money? And a point that they pointed out of removing, like, I don't know how she described it, but it was like carbon, like transportation, like boats and planes and like all our ways of making trade to foreign countries. How are you, I don't get, because I don't think what I read didn't give a replacement, like not a plane but running off of electricity. Like, it's not going to be like a Tesla plane or some electric boat going across doing this stuff. So I'm just wondering, like, making a plan, I can understand seeing like what you're trying to do, but I feel like there's such big extreme changes to our planet that I feel like she's trying to push in such a small amount of time. She said it's a 10-year plan.
Yeah, it's a 10-year plan.
I just don't see the logistics of that happening in 10 years.
Fair point, fair point. And the reason that I don't have a whole lot more details than you do, because there aren't a whole lot more details out there. First of all, a 10-year plan in Washington, D.C. is like eternity. The fact that anybody's thinking about anything that spans one election cycle is really positive. We budget every year. So 10-year plans, okay, probably not achievable in that time, but part of this is to force the system to start to think about what alternatives can be done. So no question. What does Tesla have right now? Tesla has electric cars. And they now are putting out electric 18-wheelers, right? So 5 years ago, we said that you couldn't run a semi-truck on electric power, okay? They're pushing the envelope there. Do I believe we're going to have an electric airplane in the air in 10 years? Probably not. But I do believe we're going to change the fuel efficiency of the jet engines. as we have. And that's an economic driver. The airlines, jet fuel is really expensive. The less you use, the more money you save. So there are economic drivers to get pieces and parts to it. I do not believe, personally, that it's entirely achievable, but it's got you all talking. It's got my generation talking. I think that's a positive thing.
Another question.
Good afternoon. So I have a question on a few things you said during your presentation. And you said that a great proponent to ensuring national security domestically is ensuring security abroad. And so there's always an issue of isolationism versus internationalism.
Right.
And you spoke from a very internationalist perspective. And I was wondering, how far do you think the extent of intervention should be for America, as we are one of the global leaders? And you were talking that we should be proud of the fact that we do have a lot of ambitions and initiatives to help other countries in those insecure areas, but how far of an extent should our influence be for those areas?
It's an excellent question. And it's not one you can answer in isolation. So every case is different. I think I spent a lot of time, working in the intelligence community, the defense community, and there was no question that in ensuring and encouraging stability abroad in various countries through whatever processes we use, whether they're foreign diplomacy actions, everything up to having to do a military invasion, helps us substantially. The more stable regions are, the less we have to do from a military perspective. So you've all grown up with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, raging since you were born, right? We know we're really good at going to war. We're really bad at getting out of war, right? So when we think about engaging abroad, doing almost anything to avoid actually having to go into a fight that helps countries and individuals be in a better place, so they're not fighting, so they're not immigrating, so they're not fleeing or dying, is in our national security. It's also in our national security's best interest to avoid getting into conflicts we don't know how to get out of. And honestly, the United States has been getting into conflicts that we didn't know how to get out of for about 60 years, 70 years since the end of World War II, because wars aren't the same thing. So engagement abroad does not mean fighting. It does not necessarily mean regime change. It's an option, not one I'm a proponent of, but there are ways to engage abroad holistically that prevents us from having to do military actions that we don't know how to get out of.
And another question.
Should this inevitably be a political solution?
Say that again?
Should this be inevitably a political solution?
The solution to climate change?
Mm-hmm.
No. It is in part politics. Okay, so what are you going to do about climate change? It is not a political discussion. It is an economic discussion. It's a humanitarian discussion. It's a social justice discussion. It is a policy discussion. And in part, it's a political discussion. But it covers every aspect of life. And right now, the solution to climate change is driven more by the economics of the situation than it is by the politics. China has one of the most aggressive climate and renewable energy plans on the planet right now, driven heavily by the practical fact that they can't get fossil fuels fast enough. Their cities are overburdened with pollution, and they're driving that out of economic necessity. So the situations that are going to change this planet are going to be more driven by the economics than they are by the politics. That's why the momentum is still going right now, regardless of what the political situation is.
Okay, another question.
I feel like a lot of the younger generation is given, there's a feeling of futility in that whatever we do, as people, as individuals, to reduce and reuse our use and to stop our personal pollution, I feel like there's a feeling of futility that it's all in vain against the corporations that account for most of the pollution on the planet. What can we do as a generation to combat that feeling and not feel hopeless from it?
Excellent question. What do you want to do in your career?
Oh, no, I'm thinking about going into law.
Going into law, okay? Well, here's a career path for you. You can be a lawyer at one of those corporations. Corporations, contrary to what the Supreme Court said, corporations aren't people. Corporations are collections of people who make decisions for economic reasons, driven by economic reasons, okay? You're the generation that's going to be running these corporations. You're the generations that are going to be running the political parties and public office, okay? So I understand the futility. I understand the futility. There were things when I was growing up. My parents were World War II generation. My brothers were drafted into Vietnam. I understand the futility sense, but the truth is, where you're going with your life will make a decision, will make a big difference in how those corporations make decisions in the future. So take them on. Be the one with the conscience, and be the one that wants to make a change.
Okay, this is going to have to be our last question because the buses are going to be leaving at 1. But please note, if you have questions for Dr. McCarthy, you can send them to this email address.
And for the teachers, if you ever want me to come into your classrooms in the schools, just let me know.
Okay. And when, please, when you go to the buses, please leave the papers so that I can collect your written responses and ideas. Last question.
Okay. So you talked a bit about, in your speech, about some of the CO2 emissions that we've been having that have been causing a lot of problems. So I was curious as to your thoughts on the ocean life being the #1 reduction of CO2 within our atmosphere, on how much of an emphasis we should put on the ocean life and maintaining that as a solution to global warming.
Excellent question. So really, the big impacts of CO2 in the atmosphere, warming the atmospheric temperatures, then the oceans are getting warmer. More of that CO2 is going into the oceans, and that ocean, when the CO2 goes into the oceans, it turns into carboxylic acid, so it's acidifying the oceans. That's having a big impact on ocean life. Okay, for those of you who are really interested in what's happening in the oceans, there's some excellent reports that have come out recently. The bleaching of the coral reefs, totally losing fish populations in many areas around the world. It is an area that requires a lot of attention, okay? It's going to be a hard situation to deal with, but there are mitigation things that we can do in certain areas. Most of this planet depends on protein sources that come out of the ocean, okay? The majority of people on the planet are dependent on fish out of the oceans. So if you care about humanity as a whole, then you're absolutely right. Worrying is useless. Doing something about what's happening with ocean populations. In some areas, we're able to put in structures to stabilize, as they did in New York City, to bring back the oysters that are more able to withstand the changes in temperatures and the changes in acidity. So there are things, it is not futile. There are things that you can do. It may feel like a small scale, but it's very important. When I was planting mangroves in the Philippines, we were planting trees that were protecting, that will protect those villages from being completely destroyed from storm surges. So there's lots you can do there. So don't feel futile, don't feel overwhelmed. Everything that you're doing in your lives right now is contributing. Okay, maybe with the exception of drinking water out of a plastic water bottle. But for those of you who brought your own water bottles, cheers. So thank you again. I enjoyed my day with you. I wish you well, and let me know if you have questions.
Dr. McCarthy, thank you so much on behalf of the Washoe County School District. Thank you, and thank you to the National Security Forum and TMCC for this wonderful partnership that we hope to continue in future years.